Thank you, and thank you so much for letting us have this occasion here, because the Tammerman Institute is the perfect place. They have the full microfilm of PM here, and of course they have the rest of the history that goes around it. So what we're going to talk about tonight is a mixture of things. We're going to talk about pictures as well as text. We're going to talk about the role of PM, which, as most of you know, was really the one left-wing tabloid to be started in New York and to last through the war years. It started, the first day it came out was the day the Germans marched into Paris in 1940, and it lasted a little after the war and then was succeeded by some other incarnations, the Compass and the Star and so on, before dying in the Cold War. The importance of PM here is that it was a microcosm of what the American left was thinking during the war and of the conflicts that took place during that period. And we tend to look back in sort of patriotic haze at the war years as if it was a time of national unity where we all were out to beat the Axis, we all had common goals and so on, and that was far from being the case. So what we'll talk about tonight, Paul will talk more specifically about PM as a newspaper. I'll talk a little bit more about the general politics, and we'll mention also the fact that the words in PM were accompanied by these pictures, and this is a collection not just of Dr. Seuss's drawings, which are in the first 100 pages or so of the book, but all the other cartoonists who worked for PM, including some of the ones who became very famous in the New Yorker and elsewhere. And we have a whole range of people here, including Saul Steinberg, for instance, whose 50 cartoons are, I think, for the first time published here since during the war. It's an interesting footnote, but I'll mention it. Steinberg was working for the OSS, and the OSS, Donovan had the clever idea of having him draw cartoons to be dropped over Germany in a newspaper they called Neues Deutschland. And Neues Deutschland, of course, so appealed to the Germans that after the war it became the name of the leading East German paper. They continued it without his illustrations, unfortunately for the Germans. But these pictures are here for the first time in American printed form, as well as cartoons by everyone from Al Hirschfeld to Carl Rose to people who were known in the New Yorker for more or less classic New Yorker unpolitical cartoons, and yet all of them were very committed. Rose was doing anti-Hitler cartoons in the 1930s, for instance, well before anyone else. And they were editorial cartoons. They appeared on the editorial page. They expressed editorial opinions. They very often complimented what was being said in the editorials by I.S. Stone or Max Lerner or by others. But they also had a very clear political stance, which I'll talk about a little later, which was typical of the American left at the time, both in its strengths and its weaknesses. And we'll go into that in greater detail a little later. But before I go in, and tell you more of the sidebars, as we would say in journalism, Paul will give you a little context of what PM was about and how it differed from the other papers at the time.
Okay. PM was actually the perfect venue for political cartoons, not only for reasons of politics, but also because of the conscious decision on the part of its founder to create a beautiful newspaper. It's only recently, in the last few years, that the press, the newspapers that you can buy today, looks as good as PM looked 65, 70 years ago. And that was a conscious decision. The founder of the newspaper, Ralph Ingersoll, who was very much a leftist, was also very much a magazine man and was actually the person working for Luce who created Life and made Life magazine this sort of spectacular photographic entry into journalism that it was. No sooner did he create it than Luce dumped him off it. And once that happened, he wanted to create his own daily newspaper, which was going to revolutionize journalism because it was going to empower all of the people who worked for it, writers, artists, photographers, to be able to express themselves unfettered. It was not going to rely on advertising pressures, and in fact, by the time PM went into publication, there were no advertising. And alone in the New York press, it was vitally connected to pressing for a left version of the New Deal. When the paper began, well, let me show it to you. To prove how beautiful the paper could be, I'm going to take it out of its plastic casing to show you what PM looked like in the first 2+ years of its existence before war rationing rules ruined it. Imagine a newspaper with 3 colors, black, white, and another one. Most of the time it was this burnt orange color, although several other issues looked differently. And it was stapled. It cost 5 cents, which was very expensive. The News and the Mirror cost 2 cents. All the other papers cost 3. PM cost a nickel. So you had to really want it to buy it. He created this enormous publicity campaign so that on the first day that the paper came out on June 19th, the newsstands never even got the paper. PM delivery trucks were mobbed by people trying to get the paper, and they took it over. And it relied on photography in a way that the New York press just didn't. Even though the Daily News was already New York's daily picture newspaper, its photographs were muddy and ugly, and the ink ran off in your hands. Here I'm holding a newspaper from 1942, 67 years old. And notice how well it still holds together. Now, it's true it's been in plastic, but I have no danger that ink is going to rub off on my hands. So when you look at the photographs, they still reproduce well all these years later. And similarly for the art that appeared. There is a Dr. Seuss cartoon in this paper. Here it is. I think you can recognize Dr. Seuss's style from looking at the cartoon. And so this was the perfect venue. No other newspaper would give an artist that much space on the page as PM was willing to do. So it was a great place to be if you were a writer, an artist, a photographer. The other thing, of course, that made PM so different from the rest of the New York press was in how totally committed it was to anti-fascism as a political credo. And that was perhaps nowhere near more obvious than in the period from when it came into existence in June of 1940 until 2 catastrophic events of 1941, the invasion of the Soviet Union in June and Pearl Harbor Day, which we just celebrated the anniversary of yesterday. Those 2 events were able to, the first one unified the American left, because you may recall that at the time that PM came into existence, already Stalin and Hitler had signed their pact, and the politics of the American Communist Party was that anti-fascism was no longer its credo, and what was its credo was peace. And Ingersoll flew into the face of that politics and similar pacifist politics in the Socialist Party, as a matter of fact, to actively crusade for intervention. And I think in that period before June 22nd in particular of 1941, PM was clearly the lone voice, demanding active anti-fascist activity, really demanding that the United States go to war at a time when that was not a popular position in the country at large, and it was not a popular position in the American left either, for reasons already cited. So for the group of people surrounding Ingersoll, the creator of the paper, this was a unique opportunity to express themselves artistically and to express themselves politically in this crusading anti-fascist journal. If you're interested later, I can tell you about some of the crusades the paper went on, both leading up to the war and then after the United States got involved in it. But that general total commitment to anti-fascism as being the most important political stance of the time was what made PM a totally unique place to be.
Thank you. Paul's marvelous book here is based on his PhD thesis, but in spite of that, one would expect it not to be as entertaining and well written as it is. He's gone against the usual rules in academia, and it's a marvelous read, and it does explain this very curious thing. As he said, Ingersoll had started out with Life magazine, working for Luce, and then he started Fortune, which was a paper aimed at, the very big business. And before that, he had been at the New Yorker,